You're watching Smart Money. I'm Nastasia Aransa. This evening, we're looking at something that most people have, but generally don't like talking about, and that's debt. But before we get into that discussion with Benay Sager, who's the Chief Operating Officer at DebtBusters, and Kedilatile Legodi, who's a National Credit Regulator's Debt Counselling Manager, here's one South African story.
Whether it starts with student loans or a credit card, it's no secret that many South Africans are drowning in debt. According to a 2018 report from the National Credit Regulator, almost half of the South African population uses credit to fund their living expenses, and 24% of that group is regarded as being over-indebted. Husna Banu is one of the countless South Africans struggling with crippling debt.
How I got to the position where I am in debt counselling or debt review, I got very ill. I had a mental breakdown and I was hospitalized. What happens if you work for a company, the company then puts you on temporary disability and you then get paid from your pension fund. So it's really a small portion of your salary. I had a lot of living expenses, so the financial burden became more.
Husna turned to debt review as an avenue to deal with her situation in the hope that it will provide some relief.
A very close friend of mine had a similar situation, and she told me how she got out of her situation. In my research, I found that the debt review company negotiate lower interest rates for you, and obviously paying with the interest rate lowered, I mean the repayment is affordable. I looked at the benefits, I looked at the consequences. I also looked at, for instance, if you want to get out of the process at some point where you feel like you're stable enough and you're able to handle the process yourself. I didn't feel like I wouldn't be able to get out of it when I decide I want to get out of it, you know.
Debt review is very often stigmatized, and while it may not be a walk in the park, it is a step in the right direction to taking control of your finances.
I think also why there's a negative stigma is that we don't know enough about the debt review process, and it also looks complicated. What I've learned is that in the times when I had major challenges that could possibly lead you to think, oh, you know, I'm quitting, I can't survive, that it was actually a lifeline for me to survive.
Well, we've watched one South African story, and I'm sure there are many others out there. But the one thing that stuck out to me, and this is in the beginning of that clip, is when we're talking about South Africans' debt levels. From some of the data that you've seen over the years, are you finding that that picture is getting grimmer and grimmer as you look at it from a numbers perspective? And what exactly does it tell us about, you know, what people are doing financially with their money? Let's start off with you, Benay.
Yeah, the data does indicate that the consumers are being more and more stretched. A few years ago, when consumers would come to us, they would need maybe 55% of their net income to pay their debts. And now what we're finding is that that's pushing 60%. And the overall debt levels of the consumers are also going up. We're finding that people are having to overstretch themselves more and more. So the portion of their income of the consumers they need to spend to repay those debts, especially in the lower income group, which are the most vulnerable, that seems to be going high every year.
Kedilatile, your observation?
Yes, I would like to concur. As the regulator, we do compile stats based on the credit bureau's information that we receive. And indeed, we have been seeing an increase in terms of consumers who are unable to service their debts on a timely basis. So if you look at the state of the economy, that's one of the contributing factors why more and more consumers are finding it difficult and distressed to actually satisfy their monthly obligations.
All right, so when we're talking about the concept of debt counseling, what exactly are we talking about and what happens? Benay?
Okay, so debt counselling is a legal process. It's provided for in the National Credit Act of 2007. And when a consumer finds themselves in a difficult situation, they would seek the help of a debt counsellor. So they would have a consultation with the debt counsellor, and the debt counsellor would make an assessment based on the person's income and their debt levels and their expenditures, whether the consumer is, as we technically call it, over-indebted or not. If the consumer is over-indebted, then the consumer has the right to proceed with the debt counselling process. Well, if they choose to do so, what happens is that pauses all new credit activity with that consumer. So the consumer is not allowed to take out new credit and new loans, and they agree to pay back their existing debt over a period of time that will be renegotiated with the creditors. For most consumers, that period ranges from 3 to 5 years, depending on the levels of debt and depending on their income levels. And the consumer essentially pays one installment per month that gets distributed to all of the creditors in the rate that it would be agreed with, all of the creditors. And you know, they pay every month, and when they are finished with the process, they get what we call a clearance certificate, which tells everyone in the credit market the consumer is allowed to take out new credit again. That's essentially how the process works.
Kedilatile, on Benay's, some of the points that he's raised, I think over the years we've had a situation, and I think the recent court judgment that says that a bank cannot necessarily come into somebody's bank account when they are under debt counselling to settle certain debts. That must come as a welcome relief for the National Credit Regulator, and I'm sure for those who are also under debt counselling. Your thoughts on that judgment? Absolutely.
I mean, if you look at set off, if a credit provider grabs the money that was intended to be distributed to credit providers, it destabilizes the process. To Benay's point, debt counselling, it helps consumers to make reduced payments. So there will be restructured payments, and consumers have an obligation to stick to those payments. So at the end of the debt review process, there has to be a court order with reduced payments, and consumers have an obligation to stick to those payments. So with the set-offs, you'd find that if a credit provider is grabbing the money from the consumer's account, it destabilizes the entire debt review process. So it is a relief. We welcome the judgment as the credit regulator, and we believe that it would go a long way in ensuring that debt counselling works and offers the consumers the rehabilitation, which is the purpose of the National Credit Act when it comes to debt counselling.
All right, so how does one know when you need to go for debt counselling? I mean, what sort of red flags need to flash before you? Benay?
It's an important question. Firstly, I wish to say that it's not a scary process. I think there is some stigma attached to it, but it is a world-leading process, actually. South Africa has the best system in terms of helping people rehabilitate back to their finances, and people who would seek to help, they're not alone. So if you are, what I always tell people is, regardless of your sort of monetary level, if you are having sleepless nights about money, if you're worrying about how you're going to provide for the next meal for your family, if you're feeling like you have to borrow from friends and family on a regular basis for unexpected expenses, and if you're feeling like you're within a day or two of getting your salary, that salary is completely gone, you probably should seek the help of a debt counselor. That's the easiest way I can describe it. So if you're struggling with your cash flow, as we describe it, it's the perfect time to seek the help of a friendly debt counselor.
Friendly debt counselor, I like that. So after the break, we're going to talk about various things, including good debt and bad debt. There's credit cards, there's overdrafts, there's all kinds of things that are offered to consumers. We'll do that right after this.